5 years. For 5 years, Sarah had stitched together a new existence, thread by blood-soaked thread from the ashes Mark had left smoldering. But tonight at the Metropolitan Charity Gala he planned to burn it all down. He would stand before the city's elite, his voice honeyed with concern, painting her as a cautionary tale, a desperate woman who bartered her body to a criminal for diamonds and protection. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect public execution. He thought no one would dare defend her. He never imagined that the devil himself would walk through those ballroom doors wearing a perfectly tailored suit and her name on his lips like a prayer. Welcome to the channel, beautiful souls. If stories of survival, dark romance, and women reclaiming their power set your heart racing, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything. Now let's watch Sarah burn down the world that tried to bury her. The invitation had been lying on their penthouse's black marble counter for 2 weeks. A thick, black-edged rectangle embossed in silver. The annual Metropolitan Charity Gala. Sarah Williams. No, she was Sarah Tejun now. Ran her finger along the raised lettering, feeling the familiar tightness coil around her ribs like barbed wire. It wasn't the gala itself that made her hands shake. It was him. Mark. The name was a scar that had never quite healed, a wound that occasionally split open when she least expected it. Her husband, Han Tae-jun, entered their bedroom with the silent precision of a blade cutting through silk. He was a man forged from different elements than Mark. Where Mark was performative charm and cloying cologne, Han was the lethal stillness of obsidian, beautiful, sharp, and absolutely unbreakable. He stood behind her, his presence a gravitational force, and placed both hands on her shoulders. His touch was possessive, protective, dangerous. "You're thinking about the gala," he said, his accented voice low and certain. It wasn't a question. Sarah exhaled slowly, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman she sometimes didn't recognize. Elegant, adorned, alive. It's foolish. Why should I give him this power after everything? It had been 5 years since the divorce that nearly destroyed her. Because predators leave marks, Han replied, his fingers trailing down her arms with deliberate intimacy. He was your husband. That kind of poison doesn't simply evaporate. His lips brushed the curve of her neck, and she felt the familiar thrill of fear and desire that defined their marriage. Han knew the narrative Mark had constructed, the struggling young woman who couldn't handle an ambitious man's world. But Han knew the truth. The financial abuse, the systematic erasure of her identity, the night Mark threw her grandmother's inheritance documents in her face and called her worthless. "I don't want to face him," she whispered, turning to meet Han's obsidian eyes, eyes that held shadows she'd learned not to question. "Then we stay home," he said simply, though something flickered in his expression. Something dark and expectant. That was the thing about Han. He never demanded. He simply waited, like a predator confident in the inevitability of the hunt. And it was that very certainty that made her want to prove she was worthy of standing beside him. "No," Sarah said, her spine straightening. "If I don't go, Mark wins again." Han's smile was slow, dangerous, proud. "Then we go. And if he tries to hurt you," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. They both knew what lived in the spaces between his words. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by courier in a sleek black envelope that seemed to pulse with malice. Sarah had been arranging cherry blossoms in a crystal vase when the doorbell chimed, and now she stood frozen in their penthouse living room, the card trembling between her fingers. Metropolitan Charity Gala. Black tie. The same event where Mark had proposed 7 years ago, dropping to one knee beneath a chandelier while everyone applauded his performance. She hadn't realized she'd stopped breathing until the memory hit her like a fist to the sternum. Mark's face, twisted with contempt, shoving her grandmother's inheritance papers across their kitchen table. "You're worthless without me, Sarah. A nobody. This money, it's wasted on you." He'd taken control of everything that night. Her accounts, her grandmother's trust, even the small art gallery she'd dreamed of opening. Within 6 months, she'd become a ghost haunting her own life. The vase slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. Water and petals spread like blood. "Sarah." Han's voice cut through the panic, sharp and immediate. She hadn't heard him enter, but suddenly he was there, his hands cupping her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Obsidian and infinite. Breathe. She couldn't. The walls were closing in, Mark's voice echoing in her skull. Worthless. Nothing. Damaged. Han's thumb traced her jawline with devastating gentleness. Tell me what happened. The gala, she whispered, her voice fracturing. He'll be there. Mark will be there and everyone will see. See what? Han's tone dropped to something dangerous, something that made the air in the room feel heavy. See that you survived him? See that you're mine now. The possessiveness in his words should have frightened her. Instead it anchored her. Han pulled the invitation from her shaking fingers. Read it once, then let it flutter to the floor among the broken glass. Do you want to go? I don't know. The words caught in her throat. He destroyed me once, Han. What if? If you want to go, we go. Han's voice was silk over steel, a promise and a threat braided together. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them, his hand sliding to the back of her neck. And if he touches you, even with his words, I'll take everything from him. His reputation. His career. His freedom. Everything. Sarah searched his face for hesitation and found only absolute certainty. Han didn't make empty threats. In his world, promises were contracts written in blood. I want to go, she heard herself say. I need to prove I'm not afraid of him anymore. Han's smile was razor-sharp. Then we'll remind him exactly what he lost. He reached for her hand, sliding her wedding ring onto her finger. A black diamond surrounded by rubies that looked like frozen drops of blood. The weight of it felt like armor. Outside, the city lights glittered like 1,000 watching eyes, and Sarah wondered if Mark had any idea what was coming for him. The dress arrived at dawn, delivered in a black lacquered box tied with blood-red silk. Sarah found it waiting on their bed like a beautiful, dangerous promise. She lifted the lid with trembling fingers and her breath caught. Crimson. Not the soft blush of romance, but the deep, arterial red of consequence. The fabric whispered against her skin as she pulled it free. Silk so fine it felt like liquid fire, with a neckline that plunged like a blade and a slit that climbed to mid-thigh. This wasn't a dress. It was a declaration of war. Do you like it? Han's voice came from the doorway, rough with something that made her pulse spike. Sarah turned, holding the gown against her body. It's unapologetic, he finished, crossing the room with predatory grace. His fingers traced the neckline, barely grazing her collarbone. You'll walk into that ballroom and every person who watched Mark humiliate you will remember what a fool he was to let you go. She thought of the last time she'd attended that gala. Mark's wife in name only, wearing the beige dress he'd chosen because it made her less distracting. She'd felt invisible, a ghost haunting her own life. Now staring at this crimson masterpiece, she felt something else entirely. Dangerous. How did you know? She whispered. How did you know I needed this? Han's smile was dark, knowing. Because I know you, Sarah. Better than you know yourself. His hand slid to her waist, pulling her close. I knew it the moment I saw you in that jazz club, singing like your heart was bleeding out through the microphone. The memory hit her like a wave. 2 years after the divorce, she'd been a hollow thing, singing for tips in a smoke-filled basement club. Then Han had walked in, expensive suit, dangerous eyes, watching her like she was the only thing that mattered in the universe. He'd stayed until closing, then offered her a ride home. She should have been afraid. Instead, she'd climbed into his car like a woman stepping off a cliff, choosing the fall. You gave me myself back, she said, her voice breaking. No. Han's thumb traced her lower lip with devastating tenderness. You did that. I just made sure no one could take it from you again. His eyes darkened. And tonight we remind Mark exactly what that means. 3 hours later, Sarah descended their penthouse stairs wearing armor made of crimson silk and Han's absolute certainty. He waited at the bottom, lethal in a black tuxedo, his eyes devouring her like a man starving. Perfect, he murmured, offering his arm. The limousine's interior was all leather and shadow. As the city lights blurred past, Han's hand settled on her thigh, possessive and burning through the dress's high slit. His fingers traced small circles on her bare skin, each touch a reminder that she belonged to something far more dangerous than Mark had ever been. Ready? He asked as the gala's lights appeared ahead. Sarah's hand found the door handle. Through the tinted window she could already see the red carpet, the cameras, the glittering crowd. Somewhere in that building, Mark was waiting, confident in his carefully constructed narrative about her downfall. He had no idea she'd brought the devil as her +1. "Let's go destroy him," she whispered. Han's smile could have cut glass. The grand obsidian hotel ballroom erupted in a symphony of whispers the moment Sarah's crimson heel touched the marble floor. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to painted lips. Somewhere a phone camera clicked, then another, then a dozen more. A firing squad of digital witnesses. Sarah felt every eye like a physical touch crawling across her skin. These were the same people who'd watched Mark destroy her reputation 5 years ago, nodding sympathetically while doing absolutely nothing. The same people who'd deleted her number, declined her calls, erased her from their carefully curated social circles like she'd never existed. Han's hand settled on the small of her back, steady and possessive. "Breathe," he murmured against her ear, his accent wrapping around the word like silk. "They're staring because you're magnificent. Let them look." She lifted her chin, letting the chandelier light catch the rubies in her wedding ring. Han's rubies, bought with money that came from places she'd learned not to ask about. The weight of it anchored her as they moved deeper into the ballroom, cutting through the crowd like a blade through water. Then she saw him. Mark stood near the bar, devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, that familiar smile playing at his lips, the one that had once made her feel chosen, before she learned it was the smile of a man who enjoyed breaking things. His arm was draped around a blonde woman who couldn't have been older than 23. She wore a champagne-colored dress, demure and pale, her hair styled exactly the way Sarah's used to be. A replacement. A younger, more compliant version. The realization should have hurt. Instead, Sarah felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Pity. For the girl who had no idea what kind of monster she was smiling at. Mark's eyes found hers across the ballroom and his smile widened. Victory. He thought he was looking at a woman who'd come to grovel, to prove she'd survived him. He had no idea he was staring at a weapon Han had spent 2 years carefully sharpening. "That's him," Sarah breathed, her fingers digging into Han's arm. Han followed her gaze, his expression shifting into something that made the air feel dangerous. "The man with the cheap suit and cheaper taste?" His voice dripped contempt. "That's what you were afraid of." Before Sarah could respond, Mark was moving toward them, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease, his fiancée trailing behind like a shadow. His eyes never left Sarah's face, cataloging every detail. The dress, the jewelry, the man whose hand now gripped her waist like a brand. "Sarah." Mark's voice cut through the ambient noise, warm and false as fool's gold. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent that used to cling to their bedroom curtains. "My God, it's been years. You look." His eyes raked over her body with calculated intimacy. "Well." Han's fingers tightened on her waist, a silent question. "Do you want me to end this now?" But Sarah found her voice first, smooth and cold as winter glass. "Mark." She didn't smile. Didn't extend her hand. Just said his name like it was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Mark's smile flickered just for a second. Then he turned that predatory charm toward Han, extending his hand. "And you must be the famous Han Taejun. I've heard so much about you." Han didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared at Mark's outstretched hand like it was a rotting corpse. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Mark's fiancée shifted uncomfortably. "We need to talk, Sarah," Mark said, dropping his hand, his voice taking on an edge. "Privately. About old times." Han was pulled away by a silver-haired councilman barely 30 seconds after Mark's arrival, some urgent matter about zoning permits that couldn't wait. Sarah watched him go, her lifeline disappearing into the crowd, and felt the familiar claws of panic beginning to dig in. Mark's smile widened, scenting blood in the water. "Shall we?" He gestured toward the champagne fountain, away from the crowd, away from witnesses. His fiancée had conveniently vanished to powder her nose. Sarah's feet moved before her brain could protest, muscle memory from years of obedience dragging her forward. They stopped near the cascading champagne, its bubbles catching the light like tiny, mocking stars. Mark positioned himself between her and the ballroom, blocking her escape, blocking her view of Han. "You look good, Sarah," Mark said, his voice dropping to that intimate register he used to use in their bedroom, before intimacy became another weapon. "Expensive. I'm impressed. You always did clean up well when someone told you how to dress." The barb landed sharp and precise. Sarah's fingers tightened on her clutch. But we both know what's underneath all that silk and jewelry, don't we? Mark took a sip of champagne, his eyes traveling over her body like he still owned it. Damaged goods. A woman so broken she had to run straight into the arms of a criminal to feel safe. The word, criminal, hit her like a slap. Han isn't. Oh please. Mark's laugh was soft, poisonous. Everyone knows what Han Tae-jun is. The man doesn't make his money from legal ventures, Sarah. He's dangerous. Possibly violent. Definitely not the kind of man a respectable woman associates with. He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. Does he know? Does he know you're so damaged you can't even sleep without nightmares? That you used to cry in the shower because you were so pathetic? Sarah's throat closed. The words she needed, the fury, the defiance, died before they could form. She was 28 again, standing in their kitchen while Mark screamed that she was worthless, her voice stolen by fear and shame. That's what I thought. Mark's smile was triumphant. You're still the same frightened little girl, just with a different keeper. How long before he realizes what a mistake he made? How long before he gets bored of fixing something so fundamentally broken? The champagne fountain roared in her ears. The ballroom spun. Sarah opened her mouth but nothing came out. No sound, no defense, nothing but the crushing weight of every terrible thing she'd ever believed about herself. Then a hand settled on her waist, warm and possessive and absolutely unyielding. Excuse us. Han's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk, quiet, controlled and cold enough to freeze blood. He'd appeared from nowhere, a shadow materializing into lethal reality. Mark straightened, his smile faltering. We were just catching up. I heard. Han's obsidian eyes locked onto Mark's and something passed between them, a recognition, predator to prey. Every word. The temperature in the room plummeted. Han's fingers tightened on Sarah's waist, pulling her against his side, his body a wall between her and Mark. My wife and I need some air. The way he said wife was a declaration of ownership, a line drawn in blood. Don't follow us. It wasn't a request. Mark opened his mouth, but whatever he saw in Han's eyes made the words die on his tongue. Han led Sarah back into the ballroom, his hand a brand on her waist when the lights dimmed. A spotlight cut through the champagne-soaked darkness, illuminating the stage where the charity auction was about to begin. Sarah's stomach dropped as Mark climbed the steps, accepting the microphone with his trademark smile. Charming, approachable, lethal. Thank you all for coming tonight, Mark began, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom like honey laced with arsenic. Before we begin the auction, I'd like to share something personal. A cautionary tale, if you will. Oh. Sarah's fingers dug into Han's arm. No, he wouldn't. Not here. Not in front of everyone. But Mark's eyes found hers across the room and his smile sharpened. We live in a city of lost souls, he continued, pacing the stage like a preacher delivering sermon. People who've forgotten their values, who compromise their morals for security. For wealth. For protection. The word dripped with insinuation. I've watched someone I once cared about deeply fall into this trap. A woman who, after our marriage ended, couldn't stand on her own 2 feet. The whispers started, a rustling of silk and scandal. Instead of rebuilding herself with dignity, she sought out, shall we say, alternative arrangements. Mark's pause was perfectly timed, letting the implication settle like poison. She found a man, powerful yes, but whose wealth comes from ventures we'd all rather not examine too closely. A man whose reputation is built on fear, not respect. Sarah's vision tunneled. Every face in the ballroom turned toward her, their eyes calculating, judging, dissecting. Their marriage isn't a partnership, Mark said, his voice dropping to something almost pitying. It's a transaction. Security and diamonds in exchange for. Well, we can all imagine. And while I don't judge her, God knows she was always fragile, always needing someone to make her decisions, I do think she serves as a cautionary tale for our daughters, our sisters. A reminder that true strength comes from within, not from selling ourselves to the highest bidder. The ballroom erupted. Phones emerged like vipers, cameras flashing, capturing Sarah's face as the color drained from it. Someone gasped. Someone else laughed, a short, cruel bark that cut through the noise. Han's hand tightened on her waist, but Sarah couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, the chandelier pressing down, Mark's words echoing in her skull. Damaged. Transaction. Sold herself. She was drowning in a room full of air, suffocating on shame that felt like truth. Sarah. Han's voice was distant, muffled. She pulled away from him, stumbling backward. The faces around her blurred into a nightmarish kaleidoscope. Judgment, pity, savage curiosity. Her heel caught on her dress and she nearly fell. Someone reached for her, but she couldn't tell who, couldn't think, couldn't. The terrace. She needed air. Sarah ran, her crimson dress bleeding through the crowd like an open wound. Behind her, she heard Han call her name, heard the whispers crescendo into a roar. She shoved through the French doors onto the terrace, her lungs burning, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the marble railing to stay upright. The night air hit her like a slap. Below, the city glittered, oblivious and infinite. Behind her, the terrace door opened. She didn't turn. Couldn't face him. Couldn't face anyone. Mark had done it. Stripped her bare in front of everyone, reduced her to nothing, proven she was still that same broken girl who... Sarah. Not Han's voice. Mark's. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering, but it wasn't Mark standing in the terrace doorway. It was Han, his face carved from shadows and fury, his eyes burning with something that made her breath catch. He moved toward her with that lethal grace, closing the distance in 3 strides. Don't, she choked out, holding up a hand. Don't say it. Don't tell me he's wrong or that it doesn't matter or... Han pulled her against his chest so suddenly she gasped. His arms wrapped around her like steel bands, one hand cradling the back of her head, fingers threading through her hair. Breathe, he commanded, his voice rough against her ear. Just breathe, Sarah. She couldn't. The sobs came instead, tearing out of her throat like something dying. 5 years of carefully constructed armor shattered, and she broke against him, broke like she'd sworn she'd never break again. Han held her through it, his heartbeat steady against her cheek, his hand stroking her hair with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man everyone feared. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her hollow and shaking, Han pulled back just enough to cup her face. His thumbs wiped away the mascara streaking her cheeks with devastating tenderness. My father was a diplomat, he said quietly, his accent thickening with emotion. An honest man in a world that punishes honesty. When I was 16 he exposed a corruption ring that went all the way to the top. They murdered him for it. Made it look like a car accident. Sarah stared at him, seeing past the expensive suit, the dangerous reputation, to the boy who'd watched his father die for doing the right thing. I built my empire in the shadows because that's where the real power lives, Han continued, his obsidian eyes holding hers. I became what they say I am, dangerous, ruthless, willing to do what others won't, because it's the only way to protect what remains of my family. The only way to make sure no one can ever hurt them again. His fingers traced her jawline and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Vulnerability. Fear. I am a criminal, Sarah. I've done things that would make you run if you knew the details. Mark isn't wrong about that. His voice dropped to something raw. But he's wrong about us. You didn't sell yourself to me. You chose me knowing what I am. And I chose you knowing you're the only thing in this world I fear losing. The words hung between them, a confession that felt like a proposal, a threat, a promise all at once. Sarah's hand found his face, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. Then let's go back inside, she whispered, her voice steadier than she felt. And show him what happens when he comes for what's yours. Han's smile was slow, dark, and absolutely devastating. That's my wife. He offered his arm and Sarah took it, feeling her spine straighten, her chin lift. They walked back toward the ballroom doors together, and through the glass she could see Mark watching, his smile faltering. Han's eyes promised violence. Sarah's dress promised blood. The ballroom doors opened and they stepped inside like warriors entering battle. Beautiful, dangerous, and absolutely unbreakable. Mark had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Han didn't so much as glance at Mark as they re-entered the ballroom. Instead, he guided Sarah through the crowd with the quiet authority of a man who owned every room he walked into, his hand possessive on the small of her back. The whispers that had been vicious moments ago now carried a different tenor. Uncertainty, fear, recalculation. Councilman Chin, Han said smoothly, stopping before the silver-haired man who'd pulled him away earlier. I believe we were discussing those zoning permits. Chen's face lit up with relief. Mr. Han, yes, if we could just consider it done. Han's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'll have my attorney contact your office Monday morning. Pro bono, of course. The councilman's gratitude was effusive, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Sarah felt the shift immediately. Eyes that had been judging her now watched with calculation, reassessing, measuring the power of the man at her side. Han moved on, a shark gliding through familiar waters. He greeted the city's district attorney with casual familiarity, discussing a charity donation for the Legal Aid Foundation. He stopped to chat with a state senator about infrastructure development, his insights sharp enough to make the man laugh and clap him on the shoulder. Each interaction was brief, precise, and deliberately public. Within 20 minutes, the ballroom's entire atmosphere had transformed. Sarah watched in fascination as the social order restructured itself around Han like iron filings responding to a magnet. The woman who'd whispered how desperate, when Sarah ran past, now appeared at her elbow with a bright smile. Sarah, darling, you look absolutely stunning. We simply must have lunch soon. A gallery owner who'd ghosted her 5 years ago materialized with his business card. Mrs. Taejun, I've heard you have exquisite taste in contemporary art. Perhaps you'd consider consulting for our new exhibition? They weren't seeing her. They were seeing Han's wife, and that carried weight their limited imaginations couldn't have conceived an hour ago. Across the ballroom, Mark stood with his pale fiancée, his confident smile cracking at the edges. He'd expected Sarah to run, to hide, to prove his narrative right. He hadn't expected her husband to casually demonstrate connections that made Mark's carefully cultivated network look like a child's birthday party. Senator Williams, Mark's mentor, the man whose endorsement had launched Mark's entire career, laughed at something Han said, his hand gripping Han's shoulder with genuine warmth. Sarah watched Mark's face pale. Han finally turned, his gaze finding Mark across the champagne-soaked crowd. The smile that curved his lips was surgical in its precision. He said something to the senator, who nodded. Then Han began moving toward Mark with the inevitability of a guillotine blade. Sarah's pulse hammered. Han stopped 3 feet from Mark, close enough that his next words would be intimate, inescapable. Mr. Williams, he said, his voice silk over steel. We need to have a private word. The executive lounge should suffice. It wasn't a request. Mark's throat worked. I'm not sure what we have to discuss. Oh, I think you do. Han's smile sharpened. Unless you'd prefer we have this conversation here? In front of everyone. The ballroom held its breath. Mark's fiancée touched his arm, confused, frightened. He shook her off, his jaw tight. Fine. The lounge. Han gestured toward the exit with mock courtesy. After you. Sarah watched them disappear through the ornate doors, her heart in her throat. Whatever was about to happen, Mark had earned every second of it. The executive lounge was all leather and mahogany, soundproofed luxury designed for the kind of conversations that couldn't happen in public. Han closed the door with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. Mark stood by the window trying to look casual, confident, but his fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous tick Sarah had learned to fear. Let's make this quick, Mark said, forcing a laugh. Whatever Sarah told you about our marriage. $3.2 million. Han's voice cut through the air like a scalpel. He didn't sit, didn't move, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking like death in a tuxedo. That's what you embezzled from her grandmother's inheritance. The trust you convinced her to sign over for better management. The color drained from Mark's face. Han pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket, tossing it onto the coffee table between them. Bank statements. Transfer records. Emails between you and your accountant discussing how to hide the money offshore. You used it to fund your early career, pay off the right people, build the reputation that got you into Phillips and Associates. Mark's laugh was strangled. That's ridiculous. You can't possibly. Your current firm launders money for Consolidated Developments, Han continued, his tone conversational, like they were discussing the weather. The same company that's been bribing city officials to approve construction projects that violate zoning laws. I have recordings of your senior partners discussing it. Wire transfers. Documentation that would make the FBI very, very interested. He pulled out his phone, swiped through it casually. You have 48 hours to confess to the authorities, return every dollar you stole from Sarah, and disappear from her life permanently. Quit your job. Leave the city. I don't care where you go as long as it's far from her. Mark's composure shattered. You're bluffing. You can't prove any of this. Can't I? Han's smile was razor sharp. He pressed a button on his phone, put it on speaker. It rang once before a woman's voice answered. Mr. Han. Freeze Mark Williams' accounts. All of them. Domestic and offshore. Immediately, sir. Mark lunged forward. Wait, you can't. His phone buzzed. Then again. And again. Alert after alert, each one a notification that another account had been locked, another safety net cut away. Mark stared at his screen, his face going from red to white to green. How? His voice cracked. How is this possible? Han pocketed his phone, his expression carved from ice. Because unlike you, I don't pretend to be something I'm not. You play at power, Mark. I am power. He stepped closer and Mark actually flinched. You stood on that stage tonight and tried to destroy the woman I love. You called her damaged. Implied she sold herself to me. I was just. She was never yours to break. Han's voice dropped to something that made the air feel thin. But you tried anyway. So now I'm going to break you instead. 48 hours, Mark. Confess. Return the money. Disappear. Or I will personally ensure you spend the next decade in federal prison, and every person you humiliated her in front of tonight will know exactly what kind of man you really are. Mark opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Han turned toward the door, then paused. One more thing. If you ever speak her name again, I'll consider it a breach of our agreement. He left Mark standing in the ruins of his life, the door clicking shut like a coffin lid. Han returned to the ballroom first, his face unreadable, his eyes finding Sarah's across the glittering crowd. He gave her a single nod. It's done, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief. Something fiercer. Something that tasted like freedom and fire. She moved through the crowd without waiting for him, her crimson dress cutting through the sea of muted elegance like a blade. Conversations stuttered to silence as she passed. The same people who'd whispered, "How desperate," now watched with nervous calculation, wondering what the wife of Han Tae-jun might do next. Sarah climbed the stage steps, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. The auctioneer looked startled as she approached, but something in her expression made him step back, offering the microphone without question. The ballroom fell silent, hundreds of eyes locked on her like predators waiting to see if she'd bleed. She gripped the microphone, feeling its weight, its power. Her hands didn't shake. 5 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady, clear, amplified across the breathless room, a man tried to convince me I was nothing without him. That I was broken, worthless, incapable of standing on my own. He paused, letting the words settle. Tonight, I realize I was always everything. I just needed to survive him to see it. The silence was absolute. My grandmother left me an inheritance, she continued, her eyes finding Mark's pale fiancé in the crowd, the girl who had no idea what was coming for her. Money that was stolen from me, used to build someone else's career while I sang for tips in basement clubs just to afford groceries. That money has been returned. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Phones emerged, recording, documenting. I'm donating it, all of it, to organizations that support domestic abuse survivors. In my grandmother's name. Because she taught me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, finding your fire, and refusing to let anyone dim it again. Sarah set the microphone down gently, the sound echoing like a period at the end of a sentence. She descended the stairs, and the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, no one daring to meet her eyes, no one daring to whisper. Han waited at the ballroom's exit, his hand extended. Sarah took it, their fingers lacing together with the certainty of vows spoken in blood and shadow. They walked toward the doors together, her head high, his stride possessive and proud. As they passed through the archway, Sarah glanced back once. Mark stood in the shadows near the bar, his confidence shattered, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him like ash. His fiancée was gone. His smile was gone. Everything was gone. He met her eyes across the distance and Sarah saw it, the moment he finally understood. She hadn't just survived him. She'd become something he could never touch again. Han's hand tightened on hers as they stepped into the night, the city lights spreading before them like a kingdom conquered. Ready to go home? He murmured against her ear, Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of her grandmother's rubies, the strength of the man beside her, the fire burning in her chest where fear used to live. Always. As their limousine pulled away from the Grand Obsidian Hotel, leaving the wreckage of Mark's reputation bleeding on the ballroom floor, Sarah understood the truth that had taken 5 years and one devil of a man to learn. Sometimes you don't escape the darkness. You marry it and let it teach you how to burn. Sarah's story may have ended, but the darkness holds so many more secrets. If you loved watching her rise from the ashes and reclaim her crown, don't miss my next video. Another tale of power, passion, and the kind of love that burns everything else away. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me, what story should I bring to life next? Until then, remember, sometimes the darkness isn't something to fear. Sometimes it's exactly what you need to learn how to burn.